The garage key. The funeral director's voice droned on like elevator music, but Susan Campbell wasn't listening anymore. She stared at the polished mahogany casket, wondering how 43 years of marriage could end up looking so ordinary. Harold would have hated the flowers. Too bright, he'd have said. Too cheerful for a man who spent his last decade complaining about everything from the neighbor's dog to the price of eggs. Mrs. Campbell? The lawyer's voice cut through her thoughts. We need to discuss the will. Susan nodded, following him to a corner of the funeral home where her son Michael waited, already scrolling through his phone. At 35, Michael had inherited Harold's impatience, but none of his work ethic. His designer suit probably cost more than Susan's monthly grocery budget. But then again, Michael had always been good at spending other people's money. This shouldn't take long, the lawyer said, opening his briefcase with practiced efficiency. Harold's assets were quite straightforward to divide. Susan's hands trembled as she accepted the manila envelope. Inside, the legal documents felt heavier than they should have. She scanned the pages, her reading glasses sliding down her nose, until the words began to make sense. The penthouse apartment on Fifth Avenue, worth $2 million, went to Michael. The investment portfolio, another $1.5 million, also to Michael. The luxury car, the art collection, the vintage watch collection, all Michael's. And for Susan, the woman who had cooked Harold's meals, ironed his shirts, and held his hand through 2 heart attacks and a stroke, she got the old garage on Elm Street, the one Harold had bought decades ago as storage space and promptly forgotten about. A garage? Susan's voice came out smaller than she intended. It needs work, the lawyer admitted, shuffling papers uncomfortably. But it's property. It's something. Michael didn't even look up from his phone. Dad always said you'd figure it out somehow. You're resourceful like that. Resourceful. As if 30 years of stretching every dollar, of making something from nothing, of being the invisible foundation that held their family together could be summed up in one patronizing word. Michael? Susan began, but her son was already standing. Look, Mom, I've got to run. Big meeting tomorrow about expanding the firm. He kissed her cheek with the mechanical affection of someone checking off a to-do list. You'll be fine. You always are. 3 days later, Susan stood outside her son's penthouse with 2 suitcases and nowhere else to go. The apartment building gleamed like something from a magazine, all glass and marble, and the kind of understated wealth that whispered rather than shouted. The doorman knew her name. Harold had brought her here exactly twice in the past year, and his smile was genuinely sympathetic as he announced her arrival. Michael answered the door in a silk bathrobe, coffee mug in hand, looking like he'd stepped out of a lifestyle blog. Mom, what are you doing here? The household, faster than I expected. The new owners wanted to move in immediately, and I haven't found anywhere else yet. It wasn't entirely true. The house had sold, yes, but Susan had been too paralyzed by grief and shock to seriously look for apartments. Every place she could afford felt like a cardboard box, and every place that felt livable cost more than her Social Security check. Michael's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, irritation, calculation, before settling on something that might have been sympathy if you squinted. Mom, this is really bad timing. Jessica and I are having people over tonight, important people, clients. I could stay in the guest room. You wouldn't even know I was here. The guest room is Jessica's yoga studio now. He rubbed his forehead like she was giving him a headache. Look, I know Dad's death has been hard, but you can't just show up here expecting me to take care of you. The words hit her like cold water. I'm not expecting you to take care of me. I just need... What? A free place to live? Someone to pay your bills? His voice was rising, and Susan could see neighbors' doors opening a crack down the hallway. Mom, I'm 35 years old. I have my own life, my own responsibilities. I can't have my mother moving in like some useless old woman who can't figure out her own life. Useless old woman. The words echoed in Susan's head as she stood frozen in the doorway. Behind Michael, She could see Jessica arranging flowers in a vase that probably cost more than Susan's monthly medication bill. "I raised you," Susan whispered, "and I turned out great, which means your job is done." Michael was already closing the door. "Figure it out, Mom. You're a smart woman. Use that garage for something." The door clicked shut with the finality of a coffin lid. Susan stood in the marble hallway for a full minute, her reflection staring back at her from every polished surface. 67 years old, gray-haired, wearing the same black dress she'd worn to Harold's funeral because it was the nicest thing she owned. Useless old woman. She picked up her suitcases and walked to the elevator, her footsteps echoing in the expensive silence. The taxi driver who took her to Elm Street was kind enough not to comment on her red-rimmed eyes or the fact that she was directing him to what looked like an abandoned building. The garage sat between a nail salon and a bodega, its metal roll-up door painted a faded blue that might have been cheerful once upon a time. Susan paid the driver and stood on the cracked sidewalk, key in hand, staring at what was apparently her inheritance. The building was narrow, maybe 20 feet wide, and looked like it had been forgotten by time and the city planning department. Rust stains ran down the walls like tears, and someone had spray-painted "Live, Laugh, Love" across the door in what appeared to be hot pink graffiti. She unlocked the padlock with Harold's key, a heavy, old-fashioned thing that looked like it belonged in a museum, and heaved the door upward. The smell hit her first. Not the stale, musty odor she'd expected, but something else. Oil, metal, and underneath it all, the faint scent of sawdust and… was that coffee? Light from the street lamp filtered in, revealing shapes in the darkness. Susan fumbled for a light switch, found one, and held her breath as fluorescent bulbs flickered to life. Oh my God. The garage wasn't empty. It wasn't even close to empty. The entire space had been converted into what could only be described as a workshop paradise. Workbenches lined the walls, their surfaces scarred but organized. Tool cabinets stood like sentinels, their drawers labeled in Harold's meticulous handwriting, wood screws, 1 1/4 inch, sandpaper, fine grit, electrical, switches, and outlets. But it was what dominated the center of the space that made Susan's knees go weak. Cars. 3 of them, covered by canvas tarps like sleeping giants. With shaking hands, Susan pulled back the first cover. A 1967 Mustang Fastback gleamed underneath, its candy apple red paint job so perfect it seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights. The chrome bumper reflected Susan's shocked face back at her. The second car was a 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, mint green with white wall tires and an interior that looked like it had never been sat in. The third made Susan sit down hard on a nearby stool. A 1963 Corvette Stingray, midnight blue with silver racing stripes, looking like it had just rolled off the showroom floor. Harold had spent 30 years complaining about money, clipping coupons, and making Susan feel guilty for every dollar she spent on herself. He'd grumbled about the cost of her prescription medications and insisted they couldn't afford to fix the leaky faucet in their kitchen. And here, he'd been hiding a fortune in classic cars. Susan walked around the Corvette in a daze, running her fingers along its flawless curves. A manila folder sat on the workbench nearby, and inside she found registration papers, insurance documents, and maintenance records going back decades. Harold hadn't just collected these cars, he'd poured his heart into them. At the bottom of the folder, she found a letter in Harold's handwriting dated just 6 months ago. "Susan, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you finally found my workshop. I know you're probably angry, and you have every right to be. I should have told you about the cars, about the money I was spending, about what this place meant to me. I started coming here after my first heart attack when the doctor said I needed to reduce stress. Working on these cars was the only thing that made me feel like myself again. Not Harold the husband, or Harold the father, or Harold the man who was disappointing everyone. Just Harold. I know I wasn't the husband you deserved. I know I was difficult, especially these last few years. The truth is, I was scared. Scared of being old, scared of being useless, scared of being a burden. So I pushed everyone away and pretended that keeping tight control of money and emotions would somehow keep death from finding me. The cars are yours now. Each one is worth more than our house, and together they're worth enough to set you free. Free from worry, free from depending on anyone, free from men like me who think that providing financially is the same as providing love. I loved you, Susan. I loved you every day for 43 years, even when I forgot how to show it. Especially when I forgot how to show it. Don't let Michael pressure you into doing anything with these cars that you don't want to do. They're yours, your independence, your second chance. All my love, Harold. Susan read the letter 3 times before the tears came. Not just tears of sadness, but tears of anger, relief, and something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten what it was. Hope. She spent the night in the garage wrapped in a tarp, too emotionally exhausted to figure out where else to go. When morning came, filtering through the high windows and dusty beams, Susan felt different. Stronger, somehow. Like Harold's letter had given her permission to be angry, and anger was fuel. The first thing she did was call a classic car appraiser. The second thing she did was call Michael. Mom, is everything okay? It's barely 8 in the morning. I wanted to thank you, Susan said, her voice steady for the first time in weeks. Thank me? For calling me a useless old woman. It made me realize something important. Michael's silence stretched long enough that Susan wondered if he'd hung up. Mom, I was upset yesterday. I didn't mean... You meant every word, and we both know it. But here's what you didn't know. Your father left me something much more valuable than you realized. A garage? Mom, I've been thinking, and maybe we can get it rezoned, turn it into a rental property or something. I could manage it for you, take a small percentage for the management fees. The cars are worth $1.2 million. Another long silence. What cars? The 3 classic cars your father restored. The appraiser is coming this afternoon to give me official documentation, but his preliminary assessment over the phone was very encouraging. Susan examined her fingernails, surprised by how calm she felt. I won't be needing your help with management fees. Mom, wait. You can't just... we should discuss this as a family. Dad would have wanted... Your father left me a letter explaining exactly what he wanted. And what he wanted was for me to be independent. Susan looked at the Corvette gleaming in the morning light. Oh, and Michael? I'll be keeping one of the cars for myself. I think the Mustang. Harold always said red was my color. She hung up before Michael could respond. The appraiser arrived at 2 o'clock sharp. A trim woman in her 50s named Margaret, who wore coveralls like they were designer clothing, and knew more about carburetors than Susan knew about anything. These are extraordinary, Margaret said, running expert hands over the Corvette's body. Your husband was a master craftsman. Look at this paint job. It's better than factory original. How much? Susan asked. The Mustang in this condition is worth at least $450,000. The Bel Air is around $350,000. But this Corvette, this is a numbers-matching split-window coupe. There were only 10,594 made, and most of them are in nowhere near this condition. You're looking at $500,000, possibly more at auction. $1.3 million, more than Michael had inherited, more than Harold had ever let on he possessed, more than Susan had ever dreamed of having. There's something else, Margaret said, pointing to a corner of the garage Susan hadn't fully explored. Those parts over there, they're for a 1970 Plymouth Cuda. If your husband was planning to restore that too, well, let's just say you're sitting on a gold mine. That evening, Susan sat in the garage's small office area, a space she'd discovered behind the tool cabinets, complete with a mini fridge, coffee maker, and comfortable chair, and made plans. Real plans, for the first time in years. She would sell 2 of the cars, keep the Mustang because she'd always secretly loved the way it looked, and because Harold was right. Red was her color. With the money from the sales, She could buy a small house. Nothing fancy, but something with a garden and a kitchen that didn't have a leaky faucet. She would learn to drive the Mustang. At 67, it was probably time she learned to drive something other than Harold's practical sedan. She would travel. Harold had always said traveling was a waste of money, but Susan had always dreamed of seeing the ocean from somewhere other than a postcard. Her phone buzzed. A text from Michael. "Mom, we need to talk. Jessica thinks we were too hasty yesterday. Maybe you could stay in the yoga studio temporarily while we figure things out with the cars." Susan typed back. "I'm figuring things out just fine on my own. Give my regards to Jessica." Another buzz. This one from Michael's wife. "Susan, this is Jessica. I want you to know that I always thought you were welcome here. Michael can be impulsive when he's stressed. Please come back so we can discuss this like adults." Susan almost laughed. Now that they knew about the money, suddenly she was welcome. Suddenly she was worthy of adult conversation. She turned off her phone. The next few days passed in a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and discoveries. Susan found Harold's detailed records of every penny he'd spent on the cars, every hour he'd worked on them, every small triumph and setback. She found photographs of him actually smiling, covered in grease, and looking happier than she'd seen him in years. She found evidence of the Harold she'd fallen in love with, the one who paid attention to details, who took pride in his work, who believed in making beautiful things. Margaret helped her connect with serious collectors, and within a week, Susan had buyers lined up for both the Corvette and the Bel Air. The sales would close within the month. Michael showed up on Thursday. Susan was under the hood of the Mustang, trying to understand what Harold's notes meant by carburetor needs adjustment for optimal performance, when she heard the garage door rattle. "Mom?" She didn't get up. "It's open." Michael's footsteps echoed in the space, and she heard him whistle, a sound of appreciation that surprised her. "Jesus, Mom! I had no idea." "Neither did I." Susan wiped her hands on an old towel and finally looked at her son. He looked different, smaller somehow, less sure of himself. "I owe you an apology." "Yes, you do." Michael winced. "I was an ass, a complete ass. I was stressed about work and worried about money, and I took it out on you. You called me a useless old woman and threw me out of your home." I know, and I'm sorry. But, Mom," he gestured at the cars, "this is incredible. Dad was like some kind of secret master mechanic. Why didn't he ever tell us?" Susan set down the towel and finally looked at her son. He looked different, smaller somehow, less sure of himself. "When was the last time you asked your father about anything other than money or complained about something?" Michael opened his mouth, then closed it. "When was the last time you visited him just to visit? Not because it was a holiday or because I guilted you into it, but because you wanted to spend time with him. That's not fair. Dad wasn't exactly easy to talk to." "No, he wasn't. But he was still your father, and he was still a person with interests and dreams and talents that went beyond paying your college tuition." Susan picked up Harold's letter and handed it to Michael. "Read this." She watched Michael's face change as he read, watched him realize that his father had been a whole human being, with fears and regrets and love that he'd never known how to express. "He was proud of you," Susan said when Michael finished reading. "He used to show me articles about your law firm, brag to the neighbors about your apartment. But you never asked him what he was proud of in his own life." Michael folded the letter carefully. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to sell 2 of the cars and keep the Mustang. I'm going to buy a house with a garden. I'm going to learn to change my own oil and maybe take a road trip to California." Susan smiled. "I'm going to figure out who Susan Campbell is when she's not taking care of everyone else." "And us? Our family?" She considered this. "It depends on whether you want a mother or whether you want an inheritance manager." Michael looked around the garage, at the tools, the cars, the evidence of his father's secret life, and Susan saw something shift in his expression. "I want a mother," he said quietly. I want to know what else I missed. About Dad, about you, about what matters. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation. It wasn't a Hollywood moment where music swelled and everything was forgiven. But it was a beginning. 3 months later, Susan stood in the kitchen of her new house, a small craftsman with original hardwood floors and a backyard just big enough for a vegetable garden. The Mustang sat in her driveway, its red paint job gleaming in the afternoon sun. Her phone rang. Michael's name on the caller ID no longer made her stomach tighten with anxiety. Hey, Mom, how's the driving lessons going? I passed my test yesterday. Susan says I'm a natural. Margaret? The car appraiser. She's been teaching me about engines and maintenance. Did you know that Harold modified the Mustang's exhaust system to improve performance? She says it's beautiful work. That's really cool, Mom. Dad would be proud. Yes, I think he would. Susan looked out her kitchen window at her garden where tomato plants were just beginning to show the first hints of fruit. How's work? Good. Actually, I wanted to ask you something. Jessica and I are thinking about taking a vacation this summer, and we were wondering, would you want to come with us, somewhere neither of us has been before? Susan smiled. 6 months ago, she would have said yes immediately, grateful to be included. Now she had options. Where were you thinking?
We were hoping you'd pick somewhere you've always wanted to go. Susan looked at the stack of travel brochures on her counter. Places Harold had always said were too expensive, too impractical, too frivolous. Places Susan had dreamed about for decades. I've always wanted to drive the Pacific Coast Highway, she said. We could take the Mustang. In your Mustang? Mom, that's like a 1,200-mile drive. I know, Susan said, and the anticipation in her voice surprised even her. Isn't it wonderful? After they hung up, Susan walked out to the garage, her garage now, attached to her house, filled with her tools and Harold's memories, and the red Mustang that had somehow become a symbol of everything she'd never thought she could have. She ran her hand along the car's perfect curves and thought about Harold's letter, about second chances and independence, and love that sometimes hides behind fear. In the corner, covered by a tarp, sat the beginnings of the Plymouth Cuda Harold had never finished. Susan had been thinking about that car, about learning to restore it herself. Margaret had offered to teach her welding, said Susan had good hands for detail work. 2 weeks before the planned trip to California, Susan got a call that changed everything again. Mrs. Campbell, this is Detective Martinez with the NYPD. I'm calling about your late husband's garage on Elm Street. Susan's blood went cold. Is something wrong? We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area, break-ins, vandalism. I wanted to let you know that someone tried to get into your building last night. The security cameras from the bodega next door caught 2 men attempting to jimmy the lock. Did they get in? No, man. But I'd recommend upgrading your security. That's a valuable collection you have there. After the detective hung up, Susan sat in her kitchen staring at her coffee cup, her mind racing. She'd been so focused on her new life that she hadn't considered the risks. The garage was in a rough neighborhood, and word had apparently gotten out about the cars. That afternoon, she drove the Mustang to Elm Street. The garage looked exactly as she'd left it, but somehow it felt different now. Vulnerable, like a target. Margaret arrived 20 minutes later, having received Susan's panicked phone call. You're right to be concerned, Margaret said, examining the scratches around the lock. These aren't random vandals. Someone knew exactly what they were looking for. What do I do? Several options. You could move the cars to a professional storage facility, but that's expensive and impersonal. You could sell this building and wash your hands of it entirely. Margaret paused. Or you could do something bold. Like what? Margaret smiled. Turn this into what it was meant to be, a real restoration shop. Harold had all the equipment, all the space. You could restore that Cuda, maybe take on other projects, create something lasting. The idea was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. I don't know anything about running a business. You know more than you think. I've watched you these past few months, Susan.
You understand cars now, you understand quality, and most importantly, you understand what it means to bring something back to life. That evening, Susan called Michael. A restoration shop? Mom, that's actually brilliant. Dad would love that. It's also crazy. I'm almost 70 years old. So? Colonel Sanders was 65 when he franchised KFC. You're not dead, Mom. You're just getting started. The conviction in his voice surprised her. This was a different Michael than the one who'd called her useless 6 months ago. I'd need help with the business side. Legal stuff, insurance, permits. I could help with that, Michael said quietly. If you want. I mean, if you trust me to help. Susan closed her eyes, feeling something shift between them. I'd like that. The next month was a whirlwind of paperwork, contractors, and decisions. Susan kept Harold's workshop largely unchanged, but added security cameras, better lighting, and a small customer area with comfortable chairs and coffee. She painted the exterior a cheerful blue, not the faded, forgotten blue it had been, but a vibrant shade that said, "Open for business." Margaret agreed to be her partner, handling the technical expertise while Susan managed the customer relationships and business operations. They decided to specialize in classic American muscle cars, with a focus on complete restorations rather than quick fixes. Their first customer was a surprise. Mrs. Campbell? The young woman standing in the doorway couldn't have been more than 25. Her designer jeans and nervous smile suggested she was out of her element. I'm Sarah Chen. I called yesterday about my grandfather's car. Susan remembered the call, a 1969 Camaro SS that had been sitting in a garage for 15 years, waiting for someone who understood its value. It was his pride and joy, Sarah continued, following Susan to the back of the shop. He passed away last year, and my parents want to sell it, but I can't let them. It's all I have left of him. Susan understood that feeling completely. The Camaro was rough, surface rust, a blown engine, interior that looked like mice had been using it for a condominium, but underneath, Susan could see the bones of something beautiful. It's going to be expensive, Susan warned. Full restoration on a car like this could run $30,000. Sarah's face fell. I don't have that kind of money. I'm still paying off student loans. But, Susan continued, what if we worked out a payment plan? And what if you helped with some of the work? Margaret could teach you basic restoration techniques, and you could put sweat equity into the project. 3 months later, Sarah was spending every weekend in the shop, learning to sand, prime, and paint. Margaret taught her to rebuild an engine, while Susan showed her the patience required for perfect chrome work. My grandfather would have loved this, Sarah said one Saturday, carefully applying primer to a replacement fender. He always said cars had souls, and you had to listen to them to know what they needed. Susan smiled, thinking of Harold's careful notes and meticulous documentation. Smart man. Word spread through car clubs and online forums. Campbell Restoration developed a reputation for quality work and fair dealing. More importantly, they became known as a place where car owners were treated like family, where the story behind each vehicle mattered as much as the mechanical specifications. The shop's second major project came from an unexpected source. Susan Campbell? The voice on the phone was gravelly, aged. This is Frank Kowalski. I think you knew my buddy Harold. Susan's breath caught. Harold had mentioned Frank occasionally, a fellow car enthusiast he'd met at swap meets. Harold told me about his shop before he passed, said if anything ever happened to him, I should look you up. Frank paused. I've got a 1970 Plymouth Cuda, numbers matching, that needs a complete restoration. Harold always said he wanted to work on one like it. When Frank brought the car in, Susan understood why Harold had been excited. This wasn't just any Cuda, it was a 440 six-pack, one of the holy grails of American muscle cars. She's been in my family for 40 years, Frank explained, running his hand along the dust-covered hood. My son has no interest in cars, says it's just an old car taking up garage space. But this is history. Susan looked at the car and saw Harold's unfinished project in the corner of her shop. What if we restored both of them together? Your Cuda and Harold's. Both? Harold started a Cuda project before he died. It's been sitting there, waiting. Maybe it's time to wake them both up. The dual restoration became the shop's signature project.
Margaret documented every step with photographs and video, creating a restoration diary that car enthusiasts followed online like a television series. Susan found herself becoming something she'd never expected, a minor celebrity in the classic car world. Car magazines wanted interviews, television shows invited her to appear as an expert, and younger women started showing up at the shop, asking for advice about entering the traditionally male-dominated field of automotive restoration. You've become a role model, Margaret observed one afternoon, watching Susan patiently explain engine timing to a teenage girl whose father had brought her in to learn about their family's vintage Mustang. "That's ridiculous," Susan replied. "I'm just an old woman who got lucky." "No," Margaret said firmly. "You're a woman who refused to accept other people's definition of what she was worth. That's not luck, that's courage." 6 months after opening, Campbell Restoration had a 3-month waiting list and had been featured in 2 national magazines. But the real measure of success came on a Tuesday morning when Michael stopped by with unexpected news. "I quit my job," he announced, finding Susan elbow-deep in the engine bay of a 1968 Firebird. Susan straightened up, wiping her hands on her coveralls. "You what?" "I quit the law firm. Jessica and I have been talking, and we want to do something that matters, something that builds instead of just managing other people's problems." "Michael, you can't just throw away your career because—" "I'm not throwing it away. I'm redirecting it." He gestured around the shop. "You've built something amazing here, Mom, something Dad would be proud of. But you're going to need more help as you grow. Legal help, business development, maybe even franchising opportunities." Susan set down her wrench. "Are you asking for a job?" "I'm asking to be part of something that matters, to learn about what Grandpa really loved, to spend time with my mother doing something that makes people happy instead of just making money." This is the longest speech Michael had made about feelings since he was 10 years old. "The pay is terrible," Susan warned. "He knows. The hours are long, and you'll get grease under your fingernails. I'm counting on it. And if you ever call me a useless old woman again, you'll run me over with the Mustang, I know." Michael smiled. "Deal?" "Deal." That weekend, Susan finally took her long-delayed trip to California, not the family vacation she'd originally planned with Michael and Jessica, but a solo journey in the red Mustang, following the Pacific Coast Highway with no schedule and no one to please but herself. She stopped in small coastal towns, ate at diners Harold would have complained were too expensive, and stayed in bed and breakfasts that cost more per night than they used to spend on groceries per week. She drove with the windows down and the radio up, feeling the ocean breeze and understanding for the first time why people wrote songs about freedom. In Monterey, she visited a car show where a 1967 Mustang identical to hers was on display. The owner, a man about Harold's age, admired her car with the reverence of someone who understood quality when he saw it. "Beautiful restoration work," he said, running his hand along the perfect paint job. "Who did the work?" "My late husband," Susan replied, surprising herself with the pride in her voice. "He was an artist. This is museum quality." That night, in a hotel room overlooking the Pacific, Susan called Harold's number. It had been disconnected months ago, but sometimes she still needed to talk to him. "I understand now," she said to the darkness, "why you spent so much time in that garage. It wasn't about the cars. It was about creating something perfect in a world that felt out of control." She thought about the shop, about the young people who came in starry-eyed about classic cars, and about the older customers who trusted her with their most precious possessions. She thought about Michael, who was learning that success meant more than money, and about herself, who was learning that it was never too late to become who you were meant to be. The next morning, she drove to a classic car dealership in Carmel, where she'd heard rumors of a very special vehicle for sale. A 1970 Plymouth Cuda? The dealer's eyes lit up. "Ma'am, I don't know if you understand what you're asking about. These cars are extremely valuable, and this particular one is a 440 6-pack, plum-crazy purple, numbers matching, one of only 287 made in that color combination. I know exactly what I'm asking about." The dealer's surprise turned to respect. "You're serious?" "I'm always serious about cars." The Cuda was everything the dealer had promised and more. A perfect example of American muscle car engineering,
waiting for someone who understood its significance. "It's not cheap," the dealer warned. "We're asking $180,000. Susan thought about Harold's letter, about second chances and independence, about the difference between having money and having freedom. "I'll take it." She drove the Cuda back to New York, taking the scenic route, stopping at car shows and classic car museums along the way. At each stop, people gathered around the rare Plymouth, asking questions, sharing stories, treating her like an expert. Because that's what she'd become, Susan realized. Not by accident, not by inheritance, but by choice. By refusing to accept that 67 was too old to learn new skills, by insisting that her worth wasn't determined by other people's opinions, by building something that mattered. When she pulled into the shop's parking lot, Margaret and Michael were waiting with the crowd of customers and friends. Someone had strung up a welcome home banner, and Sarah Chen was there with her grandfather's Camaro, now fully restored and gleaming in the afternoon sun. "Speech!" someone called out, and others took up the chant. Susan stood beside the purple Cuda, looking at the faces around her. 6 months ago, she was a widow with nowhere to go and a son who saw her as a burden. Now she was surrounded by people who valued her knowledge, respected her judgment, and genuinely cared about her well-being. "I'm not much for speeches," she began, and the crowd laughed. "But I want to thank all of you for reminding an old woman that it's never too late to find out what you're really good at." "You're not old," Sarah called out. "You're just experienced." The thing about cars is that they're honest. They either run or they don't. They're maintained with care or they're not. They don't care how old you are or what other people think about you. They just respond to the work you put into them. She paused, thinking about Harold, about the years of marriage when they'd both been performing roles instead of being themselves. "My husband spent years hiding his passion for cars because he thought providing for his family meant sacrificing the things that brought him joy. I spent years hiding my intelligence and capability because I thought being a good wife meant making myself smaller." The crowd was quiet now, listening. But here's what I've learned. Taking care of other people means nothing if you don't know how to take care of yourself. And you can't take care of yourself if you don't know who you really are. Susan gestured towards the shop, towards the cars in various stages of restoration, towards Margaret and Michael and all the people who'd become her extended family. This isn't just about cars. It's about refusing to be invisible, about insisting that your dreams matter, about building something that will outlast you. She smiled. It's about proving that sometimes the best inheritance isn't money or property. It's permission to become who you were always meant to be. The applause was enthusiastic and long, but Susan barely heard it. She was looking at Michael, seeing the pride in his eyes, seeing the man he was becoming now that he was focused on building instead of just acquiring. She was thinking about Sarah and the other young people who'd found their way to the shop, learning not just about cars, but about the satisfaction of creating something beautiful with their own hands. She was thinking about Harold, about the letter he'd left her, about the love that had finally found its way to the surface after 43 years of being buried under fear and routine. As the crowd dispersed and a normal shop activity resumed, Susan found herself alone with the purple Cuda. She ran her hand along its flawless curves, feeling the power sleeping under the hood, thinking about the roads she hadn't traveled yet and the projects she hadn't started yet. At 67, Susan Campbell had learned that starting over wasn't about erasing the past. It was about refusing to let the past define the future. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Mrs. Campbell, I heard about your shop from my friend Sarah Chen. I inherited my father's 1969 Dodge Charger RT, and I don't know what to do with it. Could you help me understand what I have?" Susan smiled and typed back. "Come in tomorrow morning. Bring the car if it runs. Bring photos if it doesn't. We'll figure it out together." Another inheritance story, another person discovering that what looks worthless might be priceless, that what seems like an ending might actually be a beginning. Susan Campbell had become an expert in second chances, and business was good. She opened the Cuda's door and slid behind the wheel. The interior smelled like leather and possibility. The engine turned over with a roar that made her heart race. 440 cubic inches of American engineering ready to devour highways and make memories. As she backed out of the parking space, Susan caught her reflection in the rearview mirror. The same gray hair, the same lined face. But something in her eyes was completely different now. Not just brighter or steadier, but fiercer. Like a woman who knew exactly how much she was worth and wasn't accepting anything less. The garage key still hung from her keychain, heavier now with the weight of all the stories it represented. Harold's story, her story, Michael's story, Sarah's story, and all the stories yet to come. At 67, Susan Campbell was driving a car that most people only dreamed of owning, running a business that brought joy to dozens of families, and looking forward to a future that she was creating one careful restoration at a time. The last thing Harold had given her wasn't just independence or money, or even classic cars. It was proof that the most valuable thing anyone can inherit is the courage to become themselves. And Susan was just getting started. 1 year later, Susan stood in front of a room full of women at the National Classic Car Convention, looking out at faces that ranged from teenagers to grandmothers. The conference organizers had asked her to speak about women in automotive restoration, and Susan had almost declined. Public speaking had never been her forte. But Margaret had convinced her. These women need to hear your story, not the sanitized version from the magazines, but the real story, about being dismissed, about starting over, about proving everyone wrong. The moderator introduced her as Susan Campbell, owner of Campbell Restoration, and one of the most respected voices in classic American muscle car restoration. The applause was warm, but she could see skepticism in some faces. She looked like somebody's grandmother, not a business owner who'd been featured on the cover of Classic Car Quarterly. A year and a half ago, my son called me a useless old woman and threw me out of his house. The room went dead silent. I was 67, widowed, and homeless. I owned exactly one asset, a rundown garage that my late husband had left me, apparently as some kind of consolation prize. Susan paused, letting that sink in. I want to tell you about that garage and about what I learned about being useful. She told them about Harold's secret workshop, about the cars hidden under tarps, about the letter that changed everything. But she also told them about the fear, the paralyzing terror of trying to start a business at an age when most people were settling into retirement. The hardest part wasn't learning about engines or carburetors or paint chemistry, Susan said. The hardest part was believing I deserved to take up space in a world that had spent decades telling me to be smaller, quieter, more grateful for whatever scraps I was given. A young woman in the front row was taking notes furiously. Behind her, an older woman with silver hair and calloused hands was nodding along with every word. I want to be very clear about something, Susan continued. I didn't succeed because I was special or gifted or lucky. I succeeded because I got angry enough to stop accepting other people's definition of what I was worth. She talked about the early days of the shop, about customers who assumed Margaret was the real expert and Susan was just the receptionist, about parts suppliers who talked over her until she proved she knew more about engine specifications than they did, about the constant, exhausting work of establishing credibility in a field where women were still treated as curiosities. But here's what I discovered, Susan said, her voice growing stronger. Competence is its own argument. Excellence speaks louder than prejudice. And when you stop apologizing for taking up space, people start giving you more space to take up. She told them about Sarah Chen, now in her second year of automotive engineering school, funding her education by working part-time at the shop. About Maria Santos, who'd started as a customer and was now apprenticing under Margaret, learning to rebuild transmissions. About the growing network of women who'd found their way to Campbell Restoration not just for car work, but for community. 6 months ago, a reporter asked me what advice I'd give to young women interested in automotive work, Susan said. I told him that was the wrong question. The right question is, what advice would I give to any woman who's been told she's too old, too inexperienced, too anything to pursue what she loves? The room was completely still now, hanging on every word. I'm 68 years old. I run a business with a 6-month waiting list. I drive a car that makes grown men weep with envy. And I've never been more useful in my entire life. Not useful to other people, but useful to myself. And that, ladies, is the only usefulness that really matters. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes. Afterwards, women surrounded Susan with stories, questions, and business cards. A young woman in the front row wanted to know about apprenticeship programs. A retired teacher from Oregon had inherited her father's Chevelle and needed restoration advice. A middle-aged engineer from California was thinking about changing careers and wanted to know if it was too late to start over. It's never too late, Susan told each of them, but it's also never going to be easy. The question isn't whether you can do it. The question is whether you want it badly enough to do it anyway. The flight back to New York gave Susan time to process the day. She'd become something she had never intended to be: a motivational speaker, a symbol, a proof of concept for women who'd been told their dreams had expiration dates. Her phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "Saw the video of your speech online. Dad would be so proud. Mom, you're famous." Another text, this one from Margaret. "You killed it today. Also, 3 new customers called while you were gone. Word is spreading." And one more from a number she didn't recognize. "Mrs. Campbell, I heard your speech at the convention. I'm 72 and my husband just passed. He left me his restoration shop, but I don't know anything about cars. Everyone says I should sell it. After hearing you today, I'm wondering if I should learn instead. Can we talk?" Susan smiled and typed back, "Call me tomorrow. We'll figure it out together." The pattern was becoming familiar. Another widow, another worthless inheritance, another opportunity for transformation. Susan was starting to understand that her story wasn't unique. It was universal. Women everywhere were sitting on hidden treasures, waiting for permission to believe in their own potential. When she got home, Susan found Michael and Jessica in her driveway, admiring the purple Cuda in the late afternoon light. "How did the speech go?" Jessica asked. She'd changed over the past year, trading her yoga studio aesthetic for practical jeans and steel-toed boots. She'd started helping with the shop's bookkeeping and had developed a surprising talent for color-matching paint. "Better than expected," Susan said. "I think I might be accidentally becoming a motivational speaker." Michael laughed. "Accidentally? Mom, you've given interviews to 4 magazines, appeared on 2 podcasts, and now you're keynoting conferences. I think you can drop the accidentally."
Inside the house, Susan made coffee and listened to Michael and Jessica talk about their plans. They'd been married 2 years, but had postponed having children, focusing instead on building something meaningful. Michael's law practice now specialized in helping small businesses navigate regulations and legal challenges. Jessica had discovered a talent for marketing and social media, helping local artisans and craftspeople build their brands. "We've been thinking," Jessica said, glancing at Michael, "about expanding. Campbell Restoration," Michael said. "Not the shop itself, but the concept. What if we helped other people do what you did? Find funding for women who want to start their own restoration businesses. Provide mentorship, create a network." Susan set down her coffee cup. "That sounds expensive." "It would be, but we've been talking to some investors, people who believe in what you've built, and there's grant money available for women's business development programs." Michael pulled out a tablet showing Susan spreadsheets and business plans. "We could start small, maybe help 3 or 4 women in the first year. Women like the one who texted you today, the widow in California with her husband's shop." Susan studied the documents, seeing her son's careful legal work and Jessica's marketing projections. It was ambitious, risky, and exactly the kind of thing Harold would have called impractical. It was also brilliant. "What would you call it?" "The Harold Campbell Foundation," Michael said quietly, "for second chances." 3 months later, Susan was back on a plane, this time to Sacramento, to meet Eleanor Vasquez, the 72-year-old widow who'd inherited her husband's shop. Eleanor met her at the airport, a tiny woman with fierce dark eyes and hands that looked like they'd never been idle. "I've been reading about you," Eleanor said, as they drove through California traffic. "My granddaughter showed me the articles. She says you're famous now." "I'm notorious," Susan corrected. "There is a difference." Eleanor's shop was larger than Susan's original garage, but in worse condition. The building needed structural work, the equipment was outdated, and the inventory system appeared to consist of parts stacked wherever they fit. But in the back corner, under a dusty tarp,
sat the reason Eleanor couldn't bring herself to sell. Carlos was working on this when he died, Eleanor said, pulling back the cover, to reveal a 1970 Boss 429 Mustang. 20 years he spent on this car. 20 years of weekends and evenings and vacation days. The Mustang was gorgeous, candy apple red with black racing stripes. The kind of car that made people stop walking and start staring. It's beautiful, Susan said. It's unfinished, Eleanor replied. The engine runs, but the interior needs work, and he never got the paint perfect. Carlos was very particular about paint. Susan walked around the car, seeing what Eleanor couldn't, a restoration that was 90% complete, a project that just needed someone who understood Carlos's vision to finish what he'd started. What would you say if I told you this car is worth $150,000 in its current condition, and probably $200,000 once it's finished properly? Eleanor's eyes widened. I'd say you're crazy. I'd say that's what everyone told me about Harold's cars. Susan pulled out her phone, showing Eleanor photographs of similar Boss 429s that had sold at auction. What would you say if I told you that you could learn to finish this car yourself? I'd say you're really crazy. Eleanor, how old were you when Carlos taught you to change your own oil? 35. How old when you learned to balance the books for his business? 42. How old when you figured out how to negotiate with parts suppliers because Carlos was too shy to argue with them? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. 58. So, why would 72 be too late to learn about paint and bodywork? Over the next week, Susan worked with Eleanor to assess the shop's potential. The building was solid, the location was good, and Eleanor had something many business owners lacked: deep relationships with customers who trusted her judgment. Carlos always said I was the real brain of the operation, Eleanor admitted one afternoon. He could build anything, but he couldn't remember to bill people or follow up on estimates. I ran everything else. So you already know how to run a restoration business. You just need to learn the restoration part. At my age, Susan looked at Eleanor, really looked at her. Small, determined, with the kind of practical intelligence that came from solving problems for 7 decades. Eleanor, what's the alternative? Sell everything and spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been? Live off Social Security and feel grateful for whatever your children decide you deserve? Her expression hardened. My children think I should move into a retirement community. They think this shop is too much for me to handle. And what do you think? I think they're afraid I'll embarrass them by succeeding. That was the moment Susan knew Eleanor would be fine. The Harold Campbell Foundation's first grant went to Eleanor Vasquez for $50,000, enough to update her equipment, hire a part-time instructor, and market herself as California's first female-owned classic Mustang restoration specialist. 6 months later, Eleanor had finished Carlos's Boss 429 and had a 3-month waiting list of her own. Susan's phone rang constantly now, with calls from women across the country. Widows with inherited shops, daughters with fathers' unfinished projects, retired teachers and nurses and engineers who wanted to try something completely different with the second half of their lives. The foundation grew slowly but steadily. Michael handled the legal framework, while Jessica managed the marketing and social media presence. Margaret helped with technical training, and Susan provided what she'd learned to call strategic stubbornness, the ability to persist when everyone else said it was impossible. Their second recipient was Anna Kowalski, Frank's daughter-in-law, who'd taken over his restoration business when Frank decided to retire. Their third was a former aerospace engineer named Patricia Williams, who'd always loved cars but had spent 30 years designing spacecraft instead. Each success story generated more applications, more attention, and more proof that Susan's experience wasn't an anomaly. It was a pattern waiting to be replicated. The hardest part wasn't finding qualified applicants or securing funding. The hardest part was fighting the constant assumption that older women couldn't possibly be serious about automotive work. I had a customer last week who insisted on speaking to the real mechanic because he couldn't believe I knew what I was talking about. So I had him talk to Carlos's old apprentice, who told him exactly what I had already told him, and suddenly it was brilliant advice. Did you get the job? Of course, and I charged him extra for wasting my time. Susan laughed. Good. The thing is, I don't get angry about it anymore. Carlos used to get so mad when people dismissed me. But I've realized something. Their ignorance is my competitive advantage. While they're busy underestimating me, I'm busy taking their money. That attitude, practical, confident, utterly uninterested in proving anything to anyone, was becoming the foundation's signature. They weren't trying to change hearts and minds. They were too busy changing bank balances and building businesses. The second annual Classic Car Convention invited Susan back, this time as the keynote speaker for the entire conference, not just the women's session. The audience was bigger, more diverse, and definitely more skeptical. Last year, I spoke to a room of women about finding their garages, about taking something dismissed as worthless and making it extraordinary. This year, I want to talk to everyone about what we lose when we decide that experience has an expiration date. I told them about Eleanor, about Anna, about Dr. Patricia Williams, and the dozen other women who turned inheritances and retirements into thriving businesses. These women didn't succeed because they were special. They succeeded because they had something most of you in the room have never been forced to develop: the ability to start over from nothing, to prove themselves completely, to succeed without the benefit of anyone's assumptions or expectations. The room was quieter than she'd expected, more thoughtful. The automotive restoration industry has a labor shortage. Skilled workers are retiring faster than they're being replaced. Meanwhile, we're sitting on an untapped resource: people with decades of life experience, problem-solving skills, and the patience that comes from having raised families and managed households and dealt with every kind of crisis life can throw at you. She paused, looking out at faces that were finally taking her seriously. My foundation has proven that you can teach a 70-year-old woman to rebuild a transmission. We've proven that retired nurses make excellent parts managers, that former teachers are natural customer service representatives, and that women who've spent decades maintaining family budgets are phenomenal business managers. But here's what really matters, Susan concluded. These women aren't just succeeding, they're excelling. They have lower employee turnover, higher customer satisfaction ratings, and better profit margins than the industry average. They're not just filling a labor shortage, they're raising the bar. The applause was different this time. Not just polite, but genuinely engaged. Susan saw heads nodding, saw people taking notes, saw the kind of attention that meant minds were changing. Afterwards, she was approached by shop owners interested in mentorship programs, by community colleges wanting to develop training curricula, and by investors looking for promising new businesses to support. You've started something, Margaret observed over dinner that night. This isn't just about women in automotive anymore. This is about challenging every assumption the industry has about who can do this work. Susan thought about that on the flight home. In less than 2 years, she'd gone from a homeless widow to the founder of a movement. Women across the country were finishing their husbands' projects, starting their own shops, proving that expertise had nothing to do with age and everything to do with determination. Her phone buzzed with a text from Michael. Mom, CNN wants to interview you for a segment on second career entrepreneurs. Are you interested? Susan looked out the airplane window at the country spreading below her. Thousands of garages and workshops and forgotten projects waiting for someone to see their potential. Tell them yes, she typed back, but only if they're ready for the real story. Because the real story wasn't about classic cars or inheritance or even women in traditionally male fields. The real story was about what happened when people stopped accepting other people's definitions of what they were worth. The real story was about garages full of hidden treasures, waiting for someone with the courage to turn on the lights. At 68, Susan Campbell had become living proof that the most valuable inheritance anyone could receive was the permission to become themselves. And she was nowhere near finished.